You young people, you Gen Zers, I presume, and if you're not, you certainly look it. You are welcome to stay, invited. We will make room for you on this couch if you want to stay and hang out with us a while. Yeah? No need to just be an interlude when you could be fully integrated into this conversation. Yeah?
Now we are not false advertising.
Look, I mean, so this is a broad strokes question, and then I think we'll push it a little bit further. But I'm just curious of each of you. And did we lose Storé? All right, we'll wait for her to come back. We will imagine that she is in the future, and that she will teleport back to us in the present here shortly. I'm just curious how each of you imagine your particular mode of storytelling or art making as sacred. Right? What makes it sacred? What makes it not just important, but sacred to you and to the communities in which you work? But then also, how does that sacred storytelling do a particular kind of work for social justice that maybe other modes of activism perhaps doesn't do?
I was going to answer you the poem. So I'll go ahead and do that.
Absolutely.
So this poem is called Love. Some of us are not allowed a personal crisis or time to fall from grace. We are too busy plugging the holes in the dams, holding back the crushing of our communities. And then, in that moment, we forget we have hearts too. Hold, and that we have bodies crushable. There are days to know that the bodies that make communities must be loved. These are the days to know that the bodies that make communities must be loved, cherished, even coddled sometimes. We cannot do people building if the lines of people made in this imaginary are so cut open that every wound walking into this room does not even know its own pain.
Yes. Thank you. I love poetry. I need poetry. So what makes our stories sacred, and how does that address our social issues in ways other activism does not? Gosh. I mean, to me, everything's sacred. This cup is sacred. Your hair is sacred. This breath, this moment is sacred. This beautiful art that you are doing is sacred. And our blood is sacred. Our words are sacred. So, back in the day, the anthropologists came to my people and they thought we had no religion. But actually, it's just that the ceremony never stopped. We just were always in the ceremony. It wasn't like, oh, now we're going to pray, and now we're not praying. Like, no, life is one big prayer. And each day is a ceremony. And there are ways in which we honor that, formalize that, and support that ceremony. Whether it's the way we tie our hair, which I didn't do today. My grandmas would be a little upset. Or the way we give cornmeal at the dawn. But so, I guess to me, it's hard to answer that question because I think I strive and fail every day, but I strive to make everything I do a prayer. And so I love how you're saying at the beginning of everything, your people speak these words. They honor the Creator, they honor the compassion of Creator. And because it's almost like they're reminding themselves, like, this is sacred. This is a sacred moment. And I think if we could live that way again, imagine what the world would be like, when every action, every event is sacred. So what makes my stories sacred is the fact that they're in this universe, that they're in this sacred universe, and that they're existing in tandem. Even our pain is sacred. Even the way we hurt each other, I would dare say, it's a very dangerous thing to say, but I would dare say is sacred in that it gives us an opportunity to forgive. It gives us an opportunity to learn unconditional love, to love those who harm us. Do I want harm in this world? No, absolutely not. But it can become medicine when we approach it with that desire to learn unconditional love. This whole story is sacred. The story of what's unfolding all around us, the story even of the climate crisis, is part of our story of upheaval, collapse, and rebirth, which my people have already been through. And many times. And so even collapse is sacred because it's one of the greatest teachers. They could give us graphs and charts all day about the climate crisis. We don't care, apparently. But when that hurricane comes on our door, whew, that's gonna teach us more than any graph. When we see our child go hungry because we have these unsustainable food systems, collapse can be sacred. It can be a teacher, a crucible. So I think that our stories can do things in ways that other activism can't, because stories are easy for people to connect to. Just like all the stories you taught us today, we can identify, we're human. So I think that, and if those stories are written with compassion, the world can't help but shudder when they hear them. And so I think our stories can do things that other things can't. They can move the human spirit. So I'll pass it to you if you want to share anything.
I would say our stories are sacred because a lot of times they may feel like super unique to you, but you also might meet someone and be like, oh, I also can relate to that in a special way. A lot of times I have an art piece that it's about pennies. My grandfather used to collect pennies. And I met someone else who was like, yeah, my grandfather also collected pennies. So every time I would see a penny, I connected to him. But I just feel like everything is sort of like innate when it becomes sacred. Like you just don't know what it is, but I have a connection to this for some reason.
For me, I think sacredness is kind of rooted in storytelling and the preciousness that we preserve. Like, there's a fragility for me when it comes to being sacred. Like, it needs extra care, extra attention. It's super special. And I actually have two art pieces, and they're both portraits of my parents, called The Hopeful, the Divine, and the Consequences. And I made those along with that title to bring back a sacredness into ourselves. You know, we talk about self-love. If we can see something as faith, as sacred, we should also see ourselves as sacred. And when you do that, you have that self-love, and that turns into community care, and then that turns into seeing everything as sacred for me. You know, everything from the little ladybug that might, fall on your hand, to things that you don't see. That's where the sacredness and the just looking at life with care, with that fragility, that's kind of like where you also see that we're all one, like it has been said, and then you care on a different level. You show care for, and you show like this drive for justice. And so everything can be sacred. So everything can be looked at as sacred and have the same care, and deserve the same care as all lives, from a ladybug to something that you can't see.
Story.
Yes, I just want to say that all of your responses are just filling me up with joy. I'm so grateful that we have two IRU Gen Zers or millennials?
I was born in 95. Oh. I was born in 98.
95, 98.
Okay.
I think those
Yes.
are official Gen Z, right?
Yes,
In
Gen
categories.
Zers. Yeah, I'm so grateful to have you with us and to be able to hear your words. Bell Hooks talks about, she talked about griots and how the griots would have this ritual of telling stories, but before they were able to tell the stories, they had to glean from the margins. They had to glean from what was not happening in the center of everything, but what was happening around, listening to whispers, to gossip, to stories, to all the things that we wouldn't necessarily consider to be important, but that's what made them all the more sacred, because it's not just what's happening at the focal point, it's what's happening around it. It's what's happening in the lives of people that aren't centered. And I believe that what makes the stories that I wish to tell sacred are the fact that it comes from Black queer folks that are often not centered. It comes from having conversations with folks that have different intersections that are seen as unimportant or aren't invited to the table. But that's what makes their stories that much more meaningful, because they get to see and experience and feel what it actually means for these laws, for these monumental things that happen to us, what it actually feels like and how they survive them. I think that the stories of survival, the stories of, like someone mentioned, the ladybug, right? The ladybug also is surviving. That ladybug also is experiencing aliveness, what it means to be on that leaf and eat and to feel safe or secure. Those are stories that also feed us. We are able to learn more about how to live abundantly, how to find our own spaces of safety, how to be able to listen to each other more keenly. I believe that leads to our healing, and it gives us the sacredness that we all already possess.
Yeah, thank you all for that. So as we talk about this panel is changing story keepers, right? And we think about perhaps the ways that some things have shifted and changed in the stories themselves, perhaps as the story keepers have changed. Is there a way that you see kind of the changing of the story keepers to millennials and Gen Z folks? Is there something about the sacred stories that we've inherited that have perhaps shifted or expanded? Now you talk about, right, the experiences of Black queer folks now being part of the sacred stories that we tell that perhaps a generation ago would have never been told, or they would have not been the ones who are the story keepers, right? So is there something that has shifted that you see as millennials and Gen Z folks are the keepers of the sacred stories, that they become more expansive? Or on the other hand, on the other side of that, as was alluded to earlier with social media and TikTok and certain platforms encouraging certain kinds of stories and not others, do you also see something perhaps that has been lost that came from, that should have been kept from Mama Rose, that, right, Sid perhaps lost hold of in the media of transfer? So to recap, is there something that has shifted and changed about the sacred stories as they've changed hands from one generation of story keepers to the other, whether that's positive or perhaps negative or a little of both?
Yeah, I believe that there's been a couple of things that took place that have allowed, especially Black queer folks, trans folks, to be able to speak in the way that we do now. One of those things is that, as I mentioned before, self-love, learning to love ourselves first so that we can be more open and bold, but also creating more communities of care around what it means to be Black and queer or gender, non-binary, in ways that we can feel safe amongst each other. Creating extended families has become a way that we can be ourselves and stand firmly in who we are and share those stories so that we know how to survive and hopefully to find that aliveness, right? Where we're not just surviving or coping or trying to navigate, but that we can thrive, that we can be amongst one another and see each other. That has not been an easy path, though. I think that we have had many ancestors before us that have done the work of in social justice in ways that they have protested, they have lobbied, they have paved such a beautiful path for us. And I believe that in many ways, we lift them up as our ancestors in that way. As Mama Rose is an ancestor for Sid, Sid is able to find that confidence in themselves. It's through that, I believe, like exchange of confidence and seeing each other that has allowed us to thrive. Social media has actually been effective in this way, where many people thought that they were going through things on their own. They were the only ones that felt this way. We're able to see others that were living similar to them. I'm not saying that we're a monolith at all, we are not, but it has allowed us to expand our perspective and our viewpoint of the many different possibilities of what it means to be queer, the many possibilities of what it means to enlarge the way that we see the way that we are living, the way that we are functioning as human. I also think that social media has made it so that in many ways, there are gatekeepers for what it means to be queer. And so we do see some areas where there are people that are very tight-knit about the way that queerness is expressed. And that is something that perhaps is difficult for some people to navigate, to live fully outside of those gatekeeping experiences. But I think that for the most part, social media has expanded not just Black queer folks' imagination, but people's imagination about what it means to live fully as our unique selves.
Thank you. I think you were trying to jump in a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how photo albums are kept now. They're all on the phone, so it's not like you have easy access to history, like experiences. Living with my mom, we didn't have any photos up of people, but like when I went to go live with my grandma, it was tons of photos. So I was constantly asking her, who is this person? Why are they so important that they need to be framed and put up in the house? Also, like, I would talk to my grandmother and she would talk about how she wasn't able to ask her grandparents about their history. But now that I was able to ask her about her history, she could tell me as much as she wanted to. It's anytime she felt like I needed to know this, I don't know, this street, like Magnolia, why was this so significant to her and why should it be significant to me? But I just feel like the way that history is stored, it isn't always like openly, like I guess advertised or given, because everything's in a closed book or in a phone, in a flash drive. It's just not open anymore.
I would say,
Go right ahead.
I just in agreement. There are a lot of secrets that have occurred in past generations because they haven't felt safe or comfortable to share. And I have experienced similar things with my grandmother being able to share things with me that she doesn't feel safe with communicating with my mother.
Thank you. I was thinking that one of the things that was lost in translation as we changed story keepers is just pointing out the fact that we're all speaking English right now, you know? What's all of our indigenous languages here? It's not English, right? How crazy is that, you know? And what do you lose when you get, when you basically have to be an English story keeper to be able to even relate to the wider world? And what does it mean that I can't speak Diné? You know, I can speak quite a bit, but I can't fluently speak it. What do we lose? Because those languages have so much wisdom encoded in them. Like even just the word k'eh, you know, k'eh in my language means interdependence, compassion, being there for each other, community, being connected to your ancestors, how to relate to one another through the medium of love. All of that's packed into k'eh, you know, and we don't have a word for that in English. So what do you lose when you become Americanized, when you become anglicized? And it's just so challenging to get back to it, as we all know, right? It's language shift and language loss is something that Native folks and around the world, we don't know what to do with it. Because it's like we literally are watching our languages going extinct in front of our eyes with the elders dying. Like, oh, there goes the last speaker. We're literally watching it and we can't find a way to stop it. So we really need government support. We can do it on our own. Don't get me wrong, we can do it on our own. But if we had government support to make these languages official languages of Kentucky, official languages of New Mexico, how would that change things, you know? So I don't know, that's just one thing I think about is like, when we lose our mother tongue, you know, well, what does that mean? And how does that change the story? Because then you can only speak the story within a certain construct to begin with. So anyways, thank you.
And I think there's something that struck me, that part of the goal of a scholar, of a storyteller, of an artist is to name the wound, and that we can't heal until we name the wound. And so much of the political contestation over the story of America is about the erasure of the wounds that were created. And I think about how much this festival is important in re-scripting the story of Louisville, in re-scripting the story of who is here, who's up here. And I found out my father spoke here at this festival twice, in the 90s and then in the early 2000s. And there's something about that that's really powerful about the gender of the person that would represent the Muslim community and who's here now, looking at who's on this panel, who might not have been here when this started. I'm just pointing out the story of this festival is the story of Louisville and who is at the table and who's not at the table. And I think that naming of the wound is so powerful because whenever we try to heal before that wound has been exposed, it continues to fester and it comes back and it doesn't heal. And that's part of the powerful aspect of the work that we all do, is naming that wound and figuring out how deep it went. And sometimes you have to go on for layers and layers. And I want to point out that so much for those of us, I come from a part of the world that was contested in borders. I've always felt a precarity around my borders coming from Kashmir. And now being in the US, when we lived in an administration for a period of time where we would find out if we were banned or not based on a tweet the next day. And I've talked about this in my lectures. I want to point out how so much of the stories are also around borders and land and moving people across borders, taking them from one land to another, leaving one land, coming to another land, and how so much of even our conversation and the ownership of land and how it led to the ownership of so many other things. There's something about this conversation of healing across generations and multi-generational pieces that really is tied to how we construct borders, the state, and I think about our undocumented brothers, sisters, and others who don't have the right to have rights. And they're also in this city, and they're also here, and they may be in our audience, but you can't speak up if you don't have the physical right to have the right to be recognized by the state. And those are stories that are also sometimes dangerous to tell. And if you come from an Asian American background, we know, for instance, many who experience incarceration as Japanese Americans, sometimes those stories were not shared with next generations for the fears of what it would mean to carry that pain. So sometimes what's changing is we are asking to name that wound, and I'm asking my elders to name those wounds, because I understand that when they didn't say it, it was the exposure of it may have taken away rights or safety, or also just the care that they were trying to give to us.
So I thank you for bringing up language. That, you know, as someone who, my Spanish is really broken, that we have a saying that it's like, if you don't eat beans, you forget Spanish. So you have to eat beans to remember Spanish and keep it in your being. But I think about memes. When it comes to my generation, I think about memes and how they tell a different story in kind of like a better light. And it's more memorable, it makes people laugh sometimes. And it's a very interesting and creative way of storytelling. And it's so relatable. A lot of the things and stories that are shared on social media, I think have been stories that have been kept away from people for a very long time. There's always good and bad in things, and especially in technology and man-made tools, but the way my generation has creatively expressed themselves is like, wow, I'm glad someone's doing it. There has been narratives that have been uplifted and light shown on them that otherwise, if this tool didn't exist, they would have never had that exposure, that saying of it's okay, like there's other people that feel the same way. I keep thinking of one narrative specifically that's like the no sabo kid, which is the I don't know kid, and no sabo, it's like me doesn't know. So it's like a broken Spanish, and it stems from Latino parents sometimes being really hard on the little kids about what is this, you know, like, you know this, like trying to help them with homework. And the kid is like, I don't know, like, but it's like no sabo, it's broken Spanish. And those kids, like, I've seen it in my own household, and I've seen the impacts on mental health. So that narrative being uplifted in social media, where a lot of other kids that went through the same thing can relate to, it gives them that agency of kind of like owning it and transforming it. So we're transforming these narratives that were once very traumatic, very hurtful, that we really didn't know what we were doing to each other, or, you know, family. Was the implications of the I don't know, the me don't know kids. And, you know, we laugh about it. It's in our culture to kind of tease a little bit, but it's part of that narrative and uplifting all of these voices that otherwise they would have still, you know, had, I think, a harder time healing in community and finding people who also relate. But it brings back that language, you know, that broken Spanish that it's, you know, it's identifiable. Now we have Spanglish, you know, where we dwell, or I can dwell very efficiently between the two. Like there's a lot of words that I don't know the translation for in English and vice versa. So I just say it in that language. And it creates my own narrative. It contributes to the narrative of my generation, of, you know, I'm not from here and I'm not from there. So like, where do I belong? But we're creating that path of belonging, and we're welcoming other people through all of these creative tools, including memes.
This has been so rich. And how do you even respond? To our panelists, to our KICAD Gen Z friends, thank you all so much for all the wisdom that you shared, for the stories that you have shared with us. It is evident to me that our sacred stories are in good hands, and that you have shown us what is possible in a nation full of poison stories. And we thank you for the gift that you are and the gift that you bring to the world. Please join me in giving our panelists a hand.
Thank you.